Bringing a fresh new perspective on the challenges and issues that face our criminal justice system and their impact on all New Yorkers, this is In Your Court with your host, President of the New York State Supreme Court Officers Association, Patrick Cullen.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of In Your Court. I am your host, Patrick Cullen, and I am the President of the New York State Supreme Court Officers Association, one of the largest labor unions, proudly representing law enforcement professionals throughout New York City and the lower Hudson Valley. It's a pleasure to have you join me once again as we explore the impact the justice system has on our communities and the impact our communities have on our justice system. And most importantly, how these varied interests affect all of our members. Today, we will focus on the political arena. We want to explore the process of candidacy and all that goes into it, campaigning, elections, and ultimately trying to make the difference. We want to get into what impact labor unions have on the political process and why their endorsements are sought after or possibly even avoided. We're a week removed from an election day which saw a new mayor elected for the city of New York, replacing an individual who terribly mismanaged this city from every perspective in Bill de Blasio. We also saw a substantial turnaround in philosophy in a number of races in the city council. No municipality, large or small, can continue to exist with policy driven from one side of an argument. We must seek more commonality and consensus in our civic life, and I believe we witnessed the beginnings of returning to that in these recent local elections. Politics have become so much mudslinging from social media, more so than an understanding of issues and how to address them and take into consideration all of the citizens that may be affected by those issues. I'm interested in being a part of the solution, returning to a place where civilized debate and understanding are the norm. So today, I welcome two guests whose experience in politics will help shine a light on the different aspects of New York's political landscape and offer their perspective through their experiences, where we've been, where we are now, and where we are going when it comes to governing the complex nature of a place like New York. My first guest today is a well-known figure in the New York political landscape. It's a pleasure to welcome Chairman of the New York State Conservative Party, GERRY KASSAR, to the program. GERRY, thank you for your time today, and thanks for joining me.
Well, Pat, thank you for having me, and more importantly, thank you and your members of what is one of the finest unions in the state of New York for all the work you do. During my years with the state legislature as Senator Martin Golden's chief of staff, who oversaw the committee that worked with uniformed service unions, we truly prized having the support of the Supreme Court Officers Association, as well as all various aspects of law enforcement. In your intro, you mentioned about how union support plays out. Well, law enforcement support is a special category.
Yeah.
It's a special category because any sane person would want every bit of law enforcement support they can get, whether it be the troopers, the PBA, court officers. It is a prized endorsement because for our constituencies, it's the good housekeeping seal of approval. So, Pat, with that, I just want to thank you for putting me on the show.
Ah, that's great. Thanks. I appreciate that, and that is a little bit of what I want to get into is the kind of juxtaposition of labor and law enforcement, kind of sometimes opposite sides of the coin. But we'll get into that in a little bit. Introduce yourself to our audience, GERRY. Where are you from? Your background?
Well, I'm from Brooklyn. I was raised and live in Dyker Heights. I went to Severian High School, and I have a degree in accounting from Pace University. But I early on was involved in politics, really from the time I was 18 years of age. Moved up in various roles in the Conservative Party, was the Brooklyn chairman for many years, like almost 30 years, was a state vice chairman for many, many years. And in February of 2019, Mike Long announced he was retiring, and I had the fortune of being able to be elected as his successor, and I've since been reelected. I also during the time, because we volunteer. The party leaders in the Conservative Party, we volunteer. We put in an enormous number of hours, but we volunteer. My career was actually with the state legislature in senior staff positions, and as I mentioned, for the last like 16 years of my career, I was Senator Marty Golden's chief of staff, and we did for many of those years oversee the committee that worked closely with uniformed service unions, government unions.
Certainly not a better advocate in the history of the New York State Legislature than somebody like Marty Golden, who it should be.
He was a cop. He was a cop for many years.
Yeah, he was a cop.
Yeah.
He was also Man of the Year at our annual awards dinner, and rightfully so, because of his undying support. In fact, was a crucial figure in our campaign for safer courts, too. One of the few electeds who came out and said, the officers and the court employees are right here. We need more staffing because these facilities are becoming more and more dangerous.
No question about it.
And so the state Conservative Party is comprised of each county, each of the 62 counties in New York State has a Conservative Party, correct?
Right. We have 154,000 enrolled members. I mean, there are four organized political parties in New York State, the Republican, the Democrats, us, and the Working Families Party. We have 154,000 members. We statewide get between 250 and 300,000 votes. President Trump got something like 298,000 votes on our line last election cycle. And in addition to that, we played a significant role in the defeat of those propositions last week, which really would have left the door open for all sorts of election fraud and gerrymandering. We ran a very active campaign against them, and we were extraordinarily pleased with the overwhelming result we got. Before
we get into that, the referendum votes, because they were important, and I think, it was not a national federal election year, and so I don't know how many people actually even voted. I know turnout's low in those years, but also those who did, who turned the ballot over. But before we get into that, and I think it's important to point out, right, conservative and Republican are not mutually exclusive terms, correct?
Oh, no, that's absolutely correct.
So can you explain for our listeners why these terms may differ?
Well, let me say this to you. There's no left wing of the Conservative Party. There is a left wing in the GOP. Not so much in New York State anymore, but they do exist. They're out there. But I think with the Conservative Party, we do have a social issue agenda that we're front and center on. I do believe in the GOP, many of these positions like pro-life exist in their planks, but we aggressively represent a broader set of I think views that we're looking to talk about. I mean, I think people who join the Conservative Party are not spending their time necessarily worried about the polling, for example. They tend to be just straightforward, honest individuals in terms of how they want to speak out. It takes a little extra oomph, you might say, to enroll in the Conservative Party. So we tend to be maybe a little more philosophical, a little more doctrinal on what would be normally defined as conservative issues. I look at this country as being center-right. We're the right part of that center.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And again, I think, terms get thrown around, especially these days that we talk about identity politics. You're labeled as something, and that means that you're, boxed into some kind of specific way of thinking, some type of political philosophy, which I think no matter where you identify, no matter where you register, there is flexibility to understand that not everything is completely black and white.
Well, what I find is that, people sometimes assume certain things about conservatives or, people who support President Trump, and that is often not accurate, and we do look for opportunities to explain to people what we really are. But, we don't have any problem being, you might say, boxed in as being conservatives. We just we're not always comfortable with what people think conservatives are. And like anything else, the conservative movement of 1964 or 1980 is not essentially the same movement it is now. There are different points in the history of the conservative movement where we have had enormous appeal to younger people for one reason or another. We are beginning to go through that again as many younger people are concerned about, what education policies, vaccine policies, or for that matter, how can I earn a living that beats inflation?
Right.
So we are attracting younger people once again, and there were periods we didn't, based on what we stand for. So so to your point, I very much agree with where you're coming on this.
Yeah, and I think it's obviously everything is important about in the inclusion of youth movements these days, but so much of what younger people are looking at these days is based on sound bites, tweets, things of that nature.
Social media.
Yeah.
I mean, let me just say this, and I've made this point off and on. Voting is what counts, not hitting a like button on a Facebook page.
Right.
And so many people, and I'm not necessarily young people, they seem to be all sorts of people.
Sure.
Somehow think when they're on social media and hitting a like button or making a comment that they have actually participated in the electoral franchise.
Yeah.
They have not.
Yes. You couldn't put it more clear, Jerry. I think everything is based on election day, and that's part of kind of what I want to get into in the next part of our discussion. And we're here speaking with New York State Conservative Party Chairman Gerry KASSAR here on In Your Court. What's the process by which somebody becomes a candidate on the conservative line in New York?
Well, it's similar to the Republican Party. You would contact your local, party leadership, and like you said, we are everywhere. And plus, we're in the book, you might say. You can find us in the book. And if you call the state headquarters, we're going to refer you back to the local. And if you speak to the local, they would normally bring a candidate in for an interview, and they would obviously be discussing different issues that are, mostly there are certain, overarching issues that we like to get a general sense of,
sure,
just to get an idea of what how the candidate, feels. I mean, for example, on housing issues, we're really looking for candidates that are essentially entrepreneurial in their views. I mean, we're not a regulation type operation, but some groups may want to dabble a little bit more in that. Others may want to talk more about law enforcement.
Right.
In Brooklyn, they talk a lot about law enforcement when they interview candidates. From that point, the party will decide locally if they're going to endorse or not endorse. And then after that, just like with the GOP, they go out and get petition signatures and file all the paperwork. And then you might say we're off to the races.
Right, and truly so. And speaking of the races, the recent election results last week in New York and even in New Jersey and even in Virginia took many by surprise. Can you explain to our listeners how the political landscape might be changing with respect to at least what we've seen in the last week or so?
Well, the progressives in the Democratic Party, and in some cases the socialist progressives, actually have, in most parts of the country, taken over the mechanics and actually the communications of messages in the Democratic Party, and in some cases, like the New York State Legislature, they took control of the legislature, and that is the first step towards change, because there's been a lot of stuff that just does not reflect the general view of people, whether you be in Virginia, New Jersey, and particularly from our perspective, New York State.
Right.
The second thing is Biden and Pelosi. I mean, look, Biden has just been a horrible president. Sometimes we get in all sorts of rhetoric, but he has been a horrible president. Doesn't matter if you're talking about Afghanistan, foreign policy, domestic policy, inflation. I mean, when things start to really hit you in the pocketbook, whether it be gas prices or, shopping at the supermarket, you remember that stuff.
No
I really do. And I can tell you that no one's, I'm a retired state employee. I'm on a pension.
Right.
My pension is not going up. My costs are going through the ceiling.
Right.
So, I'm doing fine. I'm not trying to make cry about anything, but, fixed income is fixed income. So, and no one's fixing the prices.
You make every point you make is exactly right, because in positions like yours, but think about people who are just trying to, or even attempting to enter the workforce making, entry-level salaries, and it's costing $5 for a tank of gas. Eventually, the pushback from the electorate at large is going to reflect, this hurts my wallet, this hurts my family, my cupboard, and that, I think, is where people eventually go, you know what, I don't normally vote in an off-year election, but you know what, there's something at stake here, and I need to look at that. And as they say, all politics is local, so why not start voting for your city council members, or up in the Hudson Valley voting for town supervisors and things of that nature, which may have people who may have more responsibility to their constituents when it comes to these little things. Like, they might not be so little. Tax issues, property tax issues, local tax issues. These are places where people's vote is actually going to make a difference in their everyday life.
Well, you need to search out allies when it becomes you against the government, which is unfortunately it's becoming. You need to seek allies that will reflect your view to buttress yourself against these, oncoming trains. I mean, I will say that. I mean, let me tell you, paying $4.99 for a pound of chicken, or these prices on milk now and eggs. Right. Come on, give me a break. Yeah. I mean, this is like actually worse than the gas. But the thing is, the gas. I drive a lot. I mean, I live in the city, but I happen to drive a lot. I'm sure people will be mad at me because I don't necessarily want to use mass transit, but that's my choice.
Right.
What the government is doing is limiting our choices by making it impossible to go and take our choices because we can't afford it anymore.
Right. Yeah, and I think, again, the frustration comes. And, I think unfortunately, politics is pendulous, right? And sometimes we see it swing back and forth. In reality, the perfect place is for it to stand still, I think, because then at least people can meet in the middle instead of trying to reach out to the extremes. That's my way of seeing things.
I mean, I would say to you, you're right. I would say to you that most people probably prefer to hear less from the government, frankly, because that's. But I mean, this has been a little more shocking for me in the sense that things got really bad really fast. And it wasn't, I mean, last year we had a pandemic, right?
Right.
But this stuff got really bad really fast outside the realm of some national disaster. This one was completely of our own making.
Right. Right. And I think you're right on the point about the president, they ran on I'm going to basically defeat the pandemic, and here we are. We're really deeper into this thing than we were a year ago or even a year and a half ago. It's frightening.
And often to our own doing, because whether it be the vaccinations or the new therapies and all,
right.
This is really not 2020. It really is a different time, and that shouldn't be the type of issue it is. We should not be having this total chaos in the city of New York concerning firefighters and police officers.
Right.
I mean, eventually they're going to show something that somebody died somewhere. They probably already have because of the situation with the fire department, and that is the city's doing.
Yeah, and we're under the same types of mandates here, and with the state courts, and it's been a really problematic position for the union to be in, because we try to advance everybody's best interests, but this has become such a serious topic that it's caused a lot of dissension. And unfortunately, listen, it's New York. There's dissension all the time, but at the same time, we're trying to bring people together under the umbrella of commonality of profession and the things that bring us together and not divide us. But this has really divided us. And again, like you said, the fire department, the New York City Police Department, and a number of other public agencies.
Yeah, I mean, in the city of New York, I'm not going to offer an opinion on Eric Adams. I wish him well. I certainly know him from the years in the legislature and borough president. But he is talking about, loosening a lot of the stuff concerning the school system.
Right. And
Hochul is not sure if she wants to go along with it, who I guess has the ultimate say. Eric is right. Hochul is wrong. I mean, he is recognizing the advancements in the science. He's recognizing that, the externally, the opinion that parents have And that makes a lot of sense. We really need to be bringing the city back together, not continuing with this divisive conversation that seems to have been coming out for the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I agree with you. I also wish Eric Adams the best of luck as the next mayor of New York City, but he certainly can't do any worse than the previous mayor. But with that said, and you did mention Governor Hochul, and just her arrival on the scene, so to speak, now in the executive mansion. How do you see the Conservative Party involved or altering the trajectory of the 22 gubernatorial race here in New York?
Well, we will be supporting Lee Zeldin for governor. He has enormous support in the party. Most every county has already endorsed him.
Right.
So we look at him as our presumptive nominee. We believe he's a strong candidate. He's raising lots of money. We believe his record in Congress is solid. He offers a different trajectory in that he will. We have had concerns over the last few years about the suburbs, but not only with Lee running, the results on Long Island with those 2 DA races in Blakeman, all of who were endorsed by the Conservative Party, indicates that change is coming in New York State, and we need to continue it over the next year. And we do think that Lee Zeldin is a good. A good representative of what we need to do as far as change in the executive mansion next year. He's the guy.
I agree, and I think it is important to coalesce behind a singular kind of charismatic figure. You have a veteran in Lee Zeldin who's been in Congress.
He's more than a veteran. Yep. He is currently a lieutenant colonel.
Currently a lieutenant colonel.
He's currently a lieutenant colonel in the reserves.
My mistake.
He will someday be a veteran.
Yes. Yes. So my mistake. So an active military member. Sure. Yeah. But somebody who served in Congress, knows the ins and outs of the state, and has been declared for months on end now to be, to run for governor of New York.
Since April, actually. Since April.
Yeah. What are some other key races your party expects to be heavily involved in next year's statewide?
We will be heavily involved in all of the statewide races. I mean, I believe that there's an extraordinarily good opportunity to run a candidate for Attorney General because, I mean, it's an opening now. She's running. James is running for that is an opening.
Yes.
There is such chaos on the Democratic side on everything that we are hoping to have a complementary candidate for Lee in that spot, obviously well qualified, and we are talking to some of the district attorneys around the state because we feel that's a kind of a logical place to come out of.
Sure.
And we will see where that all goes, but I'm very focused on that. Obviously, next year, the state legislature and are up. It is imperative that we pick up seats in the legislature. The Democrats cannot continue to have a supermajority.
Right.
Because frankly, supermajority doesn't really. And, I might be willing to say that New York leans more blue than red. These majorities in the legislature are often due to in the Assembly, in the case of apportionment, Senate, really in the case of a lot of retirements from the Republican side. So it is my hope, working with Senate Minority Leader Rob Orr, excellent leader, Assembly Minority Leader Will Buckley, that we are able to field good candidates there. In Congress, we will be working to make sure that the reapportionments properly defended so that these limited number of Congress members, because there really are not that many Congress members,
right,
do not find themselves in districts that are simply drawn to defeat Republicans with no interest in communities of interest. So that'll be another place we're focused on, and we are going to be interviewing candidates for all these offices starting very soon, because that's the cycle is really shockingly the new cycle is coming on us pretty quick.
Yeah, and it goes by quickly, especially over the last couple of years. I mean, we haven't had really anything resembling live legislative in-person legislative sessions for really 2 years. It is upon us, and I know that what's a way individuals listening to the show and members of our union can look into some more of the issues that the Conservative Party is behind. Is there a website that you guys have that they can?
Yeah. So we have an excellent website. New York State Conservative Party. It's nyscp.org, nyscp.org, or you just put in New York State Conservative Party. We have a Facebook page, New York State Conservative Party, which is extraordinarily active. We have a Twitter account, which is Conservative Party of New York State, oddly. That one is Conservative Party of New York State, which you can find easy. And obviously, we are always happy to have people call us at the office, 718-921-2158.
Well, Gerry, thank you for joining me today and lending your expertise to hopefully help some of our listeners understand a little bit more about the process and not just 30-second sound bites determining how political philosophy is guided these days. So I really appreciate it, and we'll talk again.
Pat, thank you very much.
You got it. Thanks, Gerry KASSAR, Chairman, New York State Conservative Party. We will return with more In Your Court after this message.
Welcome back to In Your Court with your host, Patrick Cullen, President of the New York State Supreme Court Officers Association.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to In Your Court. And today we're continuing our discussion about the political arena in New York. And my next guest is a member of the New York State Assembly from the 97th District. Assemblyman Mike LAWLER joins us in your court. Assemblyman, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Pat.
I appreciate it. Before we get into some of the issues and questions, topics to discuss, introduce yourself to our audience. Where you're from, what's your background?
Yeah, so I live up in Rockland County, born and raised. Grew up in Suffern. My wife and I live down in Pearl River now. Prior to taking office in January of this past year, I was very involved politically in New York State, as well as locally. I served as the deputy town supervisor in the town of Orangetown, where I live. I previously served as executive director of the state Republican Party. I worked for Rob Astorino in the Westchester County Executive's office for a period of time as well. Ran his campaign for governor against our disgraced former governor, Andrew Cuomo, back in 2014. And, got my start working for John McCain back in 2008 during his campaign for president. So I've been involved politically. I've been involved governmentally, and, really interested, obviously, in what's been going on in New York for a very long time now.
Indeed. Where is the 97th Assembly District? What communities are within the district that you represent?
So I have two towns within my district, all within Rockland County. My district is right along the New York-New Jersey border, so I border Bergen County. My district includes all of the town of Orangetown, which included in that is the village of Nyack, the village of Piermont, Pearl River, Blauvelt, Tapan, and then part of the town of Ramapo I have. So I run the border, Chestnut Ridge, Airmont, Suffern, Hillburn, and then I have Spring Valley, Muncie, New Square, Hillcrest, part of Montebello, and Tallman within my district.
Yeah, one of the reasons I really ask you what communities you represent, because these communities are home to so many of our members, including Rockland Supreme Court. But I want to point out, when we have guests on our program, especially elected officials, the folks that we're speaking to are directly representing, hundreds of our members and their families. And so that's really why I want to point out, the long list of communities you actually represent,
No, absolutely, and I appreciate that. My district certainly is home to a lot of law enforcement officers, first responders, court officers. So it's really a great district. I'm proud of the communities that I represent in the New York State Assembly, and certainly know many of your members and many of those within the law enforcement community at large and our first responders. So definitely I know that my district is home to many of your members.
Absolutely. What committees do you sit on in the Assembly?
So I'm the ranker on GovOps, and I serve also on aging, banks, education, and housing.
Yeah, and government operations is really crucial to, state employees like the members of our union at the Supreme Court Officers Association. And so the ability to have a discussion about how you feel about some of the things going on in the state, and not even specifically from, what the general ideas of what parties are thinking or what Twitter is thinking or what you're being fed in sound bites on television and things. What is the elected official thinking? So my question is, let's talk about bail reform legislation to start. Generally speaking, what are your thoughts and your positions on the matter?
So I ran on this issue last year when I was running. I ran against a 14-year incumbent who was one of the chief co-sponsors of bail reform. And I was adamantly opposed to it then. I'm adamantly opposed to it today. I think bail reform has been an unmitigated disaster in New York State. It was poorly handled by the Democratic majorities in Albany. The state of New Jersey passed a similar reform, but they allowed for judicial discretion.
Right.
There's no question when you look, especially in New York City, that there are challenges. There's challenges with respect to the court system and the backlog of cases and the ability of the accused to get a speedy trial or to get a court hearing.
Right.
And so that's something that certainly needs to be looked at as to how we can improve our court system. But to take a issue, especially as pertained to Rikers Island and the backlog of cases that was there, and turn that into a statewide, bill to completely upend the way that we adjudicate violent felonies and violent crime, and allow people to walk free within hours of being arrested.
Right.
And not allow the judges to have discretion in looking at their history, in looking at the evidence within the case, and looking at the merits of the charges brought, was a real disaster in so many ways. And so I've introduced legislation to completely repeal bail reform, and I've introduced legislation to allow judges more discretion
Right.
When administering bail, especially for violent crimes.
Right.
And I think this is something where we've seen just recently in Long Island, where Senator Todd Kaminsky, one of the chief authors of the bill, got annihilated in his campaign for district attorney. Voters and residents are recognizing that this has been a disaster and that people have been harmed directly because of this policy, and directly because criminals are being allowed back on our streets within hours to recommit the same crimes or even worse offenses. And it needs to stop. Yeah. And it needs to stop immediately.
These are the front page, what formerly were the front page stories, right? In the past, where somebody would make bail and go out and, commit another horrific crime, which, maybe took the life of innocent folks. Now it's the everyday happening. It's the common approach. Every day, people are arrested, walked through basically a police department, handed a piece of paper, and told to go on their way, to basically, in many cases, go and commit more crime. So, beyond total repeal, is there a common sense solution that number one, creates a safer New York, but also represents the interest of all parties that are involved with the debate?
Absolutely. And I think we can all agree that there are certain offenses that don't necessarily warrant bail, and that somebody being released on their own recognizance is fine. But I think the problem here was the list of offenses that qualified for cashless bail. And I think we really need to start from scratch. I think the new mayor, Eric Adams, indicated the other day that he wants Albany to take a fresh look at bail reform and how we fix it.
Indeed.
And I think, he ran on that. He won on that overwhelmingly. And I think my colleagues in the state legislature, especially from New York City, need to listen to the mayor incoming, because he's the one that has to deal with it. He's the one that has to work with the police department. He's the one that has to work with our court officers. He's the one that's going to have to oversee a city that has been besieged by crime.
Right.
And so when he's asking for help, we have a responsibility and a duty to act. And I think my colleagues need to check their politics at the door and recognize that this has failed and failed miserably.
Yeah, it's a topic and an issue, obviously causes the cause of a lot of consternation over the last couple of years, but one that I really think everybody needs to come in from the extreme fringes and meet a little bit closer to the middle on this, because you're right, Assemblyman, there are absolutely cases where bail is probably going to harm an individual, but there are certain cases where it absolutely provides a safer environment for our neighbors, our friends and neighbors, the citizens, your constituents.
No question.
So Rockland County, and we'll move on to another topic here, and we're speaking with Assemblyman Mike Lawler from the 97th Assembly District, covering large portions of Rockland County here on In Your Court. Rockland County is an area that was affected by a horrific crime back in 1981. And it's a crime, a 40-year-old crime that continues to be in the news all these years later, mainly because of controversial parole board issues surrounding it. Can you just tell us the circumstances of that crime, the Brinks truck robbery, and why it's still being discussed in general in your position on the parole board as a whole?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought this up. I think this is a critically important issue. 40 years ago, this past October, David Gilbert, Judith Clark, a number of the Weather Underground partook in one of the most horrific crimes in Rockland County, and resulted in the death of Nyack Police Sergeant Edward O'Grady, Officer Waverly Brown, and Brinks security guard Peter Page.
Right.
And ultimately, they were all convicted of murder, as they should have been. And David Gilbert was sentenced to 75 years to life, which was the most that he could be sentenced at the time. And on his way out the door, our disgraced former governor, Andrew Cuomo, granted clemency to David Gilbert,
right,
making him eligible for parole. And the parole board, which has all been appointed by Cuomo at this point, decided in their infinite wisdom, as they did with Judith Clark, as they did with Herman Bell, as they did with the killers of a 16-year-old child in Pearl River in my community, Paula Bohoveski. They released her killers within the last 2 years, Richard LaBarbera and Robert McCain. They decided to grant him parole. And they have since, as of this morning, we saw the news, they released him last week.
Right.
And the fact that David Gilbert is going to be spending Thanksgiving with his family while 9 children have been fatherless for 40 years speaks volumes to how our society is headed in the wrong direction. When anyone is convicted of a crime that results in the death of a law enforcement officer, as far as I'm concerned, they belong in prison the rest of their lives. If we as a society cannot respect those in law enforcement who are sworn to uphold our laws and protect our communities, and they are the victim of a crime, and we cannot hold those people to full account, there is something wrong in our society. And so I will be introducing next week a series of parole reform bills that will ensure, number one, that anybody convicted of a crime resulting in the death of a law enforcement officer, a court officer, a first responder, will be held in jail for the rest of their lives without the possibility of parole, number one. Number two, I will seek to rein in the authority of the governor in cases where a law enforcement officer was killed, to grant clemency, to grant a pardon, and to ensure that the governor cannot undo the will of a jury of one's peers or a duly elected or appointed judge. And I think it's critically important that we not allow this woke society that we are currently living in to do things that really bring irreparable harm to the victims' families. And that's what's happened in this case, and it's really a travesty.
You really couldn't have spoken about it more eloquently, Assemblyman, because it's so true that every crime, especially something like the the murder of folks in uniform who are sworn to just try and keep their fellow citizens safe. All these years later, it shouldn't matter how many years are in between. There are families that are still grieving and still affected terribly by those. What I amount to, terroristic acts. I think under federal legislation passed many years later, these folks would have been prosecuted as under federal law as terrorists.
No question that this was an act of domestic terrorism. Mm-hmm. And for those who say, well, David Gilbert didn't pull the trigger, nonsense. David Gilbert and his wife, Kathy Boudin, participated in the planning and the execution of this crime. They were, quote unquote, the getaway drivers, and they sought to trick law enforcement into believing that they were not part of the act. Law enforcement let their guard down, and the individuals came out the back of the truck and killed them, assassinated them. And I think for anybody to claim that they were some innocent bystanders in this whole process is really just a slap in the face. And they were rightfully convicted, and they should have remained behind bars for the rest of their lives.
Well, kudos to you, too, for bringing up something that I don't think a lot of New Yorkers really think about, and that is the parole board. Whether you like the way it's set up or how people are appointed is indifferent, really. At the end of the day, it's not front page news. It's not leading, and it's not getting driving clicks, as they say. So, again, kudos to you for bringing up something that is important. We're releasing individuals who have acted in such a horrific manner back into the community. That should be front page news. That should be promulgated to the public.
The problem is that these individuals that are on the parole board are, fulfilling a political agenda.
Sure.
And they are not making decisions based on the best interests of our communities or our society or the victims. And they are really pushing this idea that the criminals are the victims.
Right.
Everybody else is crazy for having a mindset that criminals should be held accountable for their actions. And if that requires holding somebody behind bars for the rest of their lives, so be it.
I would tend to agree with you. Tell us about any programs you've developed or participated in, especially in recent past, and support of our law enforcement community in general, but specifically maybe relating to September 11th related legislation or programs.
Well, absolutely. And this was obviously the 20th anniversary of 9/11 almost 2 months ago. Mm-hmm. And, I was a freshman in high school on September 11th, 2001. It was my fifth day of freshman year. I remember everything about it, and the impact that it had on my community, just 25 miles from New York City as the crow flies.
Sure.
And it certainly is something that will live with with us the rest of our lives, and something we will definitely never forget. But one of the things that I thought was so important, especially having been a high school student on the day of September 11th, is to ensure that 9/11 is taught in our curriculum.
Right.
And so I have introduced legislation that would require the State Department of Education to promulgate rules and ensure that 9/11 is part of the curriculum that is taught in our schools. I think it is critically important that every child understand what occurred that day, the heroic sacrifices of our first responders, our firefighters, our police officers, our EMT workers, to really ensure that people understand the true toll that those events took. And I've also introduced legislation that would make 9/11 a state holiday, and ensure that we really put aside the time to reflect and remember the events of that day, and especially as the years start to pass, I think it's critically important that we take that time and set it aside and recognize the events of that day. And I've also introduced legislation, not related to 9/11, but that supports our law enforcement officers and first responders. I've introduced legislation that would reinstate 50A. One of my problems with the repeal of 50A had to do with the hypocrisy of the legislature. The New York State Assembly, under its rules, exempts itself from being subject to FOIL.
Right.
And exempts its personnel files from being subject to FOIL. And under the repeal of 50A, it made all personnel files for law enforcement officers subject to FOIL.
Right.
And the hypocrisy to me is just jarring and unacceptable. If we as legislators are going to pass laws, we should hold ourselves to the same standard.
Yeah, first and foremost, absolutely.
No question. And there's been legislation to repeal qualified immunity for law enforcement. I've put in legislation to ensure that every elected official in the state of New York loses absolute immunity and qualified immunity, and that they be held to that same standard. If that's what my colleagues in New York City primarily seem to be pushing for, they should be held to that same standard.
Well, first of all, let me say, it's a breath of fresh air to have an elected official on a statewide level come on this program or any other and stand by the old, against this idea of it's for ye but not for me, right? That we see, and that hypocritical aspect of, well, we have control of this over here, but it really doesn't apply to us. Your courage to stand up to that is commendable beyond belief. Secondly, we lost 3 members of our union on 9/11, and we've all obviously as a community vowed to never forget. And the only way we're going to truly never forget is to pass on the legacy, the understanding, what we learned, what we did right, what we did wrong surrounding 9/11. And having elected officials like yourself lead the charge on that is, something we'll absolutely always get behind. So we appreciate that.
Absolutely. And it's, it was remarkable this year I attended numerous 9/11 ceremonies, but to hear directly from those who were down at Ground Zero on the day of 9/11, in the days and weeks after.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think is so important to recognize, obviously, is that we still have, first responders, law enforcement officers who are getting sick and dying as a result of 9/11 related illnesses. We are going to be working on a piece of legislation surrounding that and how we can make it easier for those who have come down with 9/11 related illnesses to get the help and support that they deserve.
In the last couple of minutes we have here, Assemblyman, I recognize, all politics is local, right? Here's a local issue that I read up on that your constituents were dealing with, and I want to address it, obviously because it's something that is important to you, important to your constituents, which, like I said, are our members, but it's important to working men and women. This issue about the school bus shortage, right? This is affecting workers because workers are having to come to work late or take days off in order to get their kids to school, which has always been kind of a function of local government. Can you just briefly kind of give us an update on where that whole issue stands?
Yeah, so, this was something that I raised concern about over the summer after meeting with one of my local school bus companies
right.
that support 3 of the school districts in my assembly district. And they were saying, we're going to have a real shortage. We're down 100 drivers. And so I reached out to the Department of Labor, asked them to share with the school bus company and the school districts across the state a list of drivers with CDL licenses who were collecting unemployment. And they refused. And they would not share that information. They said, we'll send an email out in October. Which was really just jarring to me, given that obviously school starts in September.
Yeah.
And of course, lo and behold, we had a school bus driver shortage. And, it's certainly gotten better in the last few weeks. I know from speaking to some of my districts, there's still a few, challenges here and there, but they've really been able to kind of get it under control. Yeah. But this was something that was avoidable. But it's something that we need to address going forward.
Great.
And so that we don't have the same problem or challenge again. And so one of the things that I want to do is lift the cap on, what a retired, what a retiree may be able to earn without a waiver from 35 to 50,
right.
To help try and get, maybe some of our retired court officers,
sure.
retired officers, firefighters, who want to help out in the community, want to continue to serve, but obviously, the $35,000 cap, cuts against the ability to do something like driving a bus part-time. So
okay.
That's something, a measure that I'm looking at to see what we can do to try and address that. We did push for third-party testing. The governor followed through on that, so I was happy to see that she took our recommendation on allowing for third-party testing. And they did ultimately, the Department of Labor, share the list of CDL drivers who are collecting unemployment with the bus companies. So, it came late, but it did come at a certain point.
That's great, and I appreciate the update because it does have an effect on so many people. Assemblyman Mike Lowe, we're out of time, unfortunately. We'll come back again and visit us again. We thank you for your support and all that you do for your constituents and our members, and we wish you the best of luck. And thanks again for joining me in your court today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pat, and God bless you and your members.
Likewise. Well, that's another episode of In Your Court. Thank you for listening. Well, remember, we air 8 a.m. Saturdays and noon on Sundays. And for further information about our organization, please visit nysscoa.org.